On the 14th of May 1948, the British mandate to rule Palestine came to an end and the new state of Israel was born. Immediately, a League of Arab nations attacked Israel, and that was the first of a series of wars between Israel and Arab states that led to warfare and conflict in the region that still rumbles on today. So, what were the causes of this conflict? What were the roots of this tension between the two communities? Well, a good place to start is at the end of the 19th century. There was a group amongst the international Jewish community called the Zionists, and at the time it was led by a chap called Theodor Herzl. And they continued the Jewish tradition, the biblical tradition, that 1,000 years before Jesus, there was a kingdom of Israel, which was a homeland to the Jews, which was located around Jerusalem, which was at the time Palestine. And over a series of centuries after invasion by the Syrians and the Babylonians and the Romans, the Jewish people were exiled from their homeland. They spread to the four corners of the earth. But when they went to these new countries, they tried to keep their religion, their language, their customs. But this caused a lot of mistrust with the communities in which they found themselves. And so Jews were very often the victims of persecution throughout the centuries. And Herzl and the Zionists said that the only way that the Jewish community could fully thrive, could fully find freedom, could fully be safe, would be to return back home to, as they saw it, their ancient kingdom of Israel. And so they began to raise sums of money to help Jews across the world to do that. And at the time, particularly in Eastern Europe and Russia, there was horrific persecution and violence towards Jewish communities. There were incredibly bloody pogroms against Jews in Russia. So many Jews took advantage and joined the Zionist movement. And by the start of the First World War, about 60,000 Jews had moved into the area. Now, the area of Palestine at the time was controlled by the Ottoman Empire, a vast Muslim empire. And the Palestinian Arabs who lived in the area, many of them didn't think much of Jews coming into settling and buying land, but others did. There were some reports of tension and violence between the two communities dating back to the 1880s and the 1890s. So when the First World War started in 1914, the Ottoman Emperor decided to join an alliance with the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians against the British, French and Russians. And this meant that the British said to the Palestinians and to other Arabs living in the Ottoman Empire, they said, look, if you rise up against your leaders, if you support us in the war effort against your leaders, then we will give you your own nation states when the war's over. So Palestinians, you will have your own country of Palestine if you support us. And this did lead to quite a lot of Arab rebellious activity at the time, Arab resistance groups, which did have a significant impact on the Ottoman military effort. But the British government was sending mixed signals. Because in 1917, the British Foreign Secretary at the time, Balfour, issued a declaration that said, and I quote, the British government would favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. Not at the expense of the Palestinian people, he added later. But the Jews and the Zionist community saw this as a declaration by the British government that they would support Jewish immigration to Palestine and the establishment of their own country in that region. So the British government defeated the British Army defeated the Ottoman military in the area by 1917, and in 1920 it was established that the British would control that area of the Ottoman Empire. So this period of British control of the region begins. Now, during this time in Europe, there was more anti-Semitism, with Nazism emerging in Germany, and growing anti-Semitism in Austria as well. And this led to more and more Jewish people buying up land in Palestine and emigrating to the area. And this again caused more tension, more violence with the Palestinians. And there were riots and attacks against Jewish communities. Most famously in Jaffa in 1921, there was a lot of bloodshed there. And this caused the Jewish communities to begin to think about protecting themselves and arming themselves. And several military groups began to be established by the Jewish communities. One of the largest was the Haganah, but there are also more extreme military groups cropped up, like the Irgun. So as the levels of immigration almost doubled in this period, the Arabs stepped up their violent attacks against Jewish communities. The tension escalated. There was rioting by Arab communities in many areas. And this led to a period of violence known as the Arab Revolt between 1936 and 1939. Now, the British, concerned about the growing violence and tension in the area, they decided to launch a series of commissions to see if they could find a way to solve these problems. Now, there were several commissions. There's the Haycroft Commission, the Shaw Report, the Peel Commission, the Woodhead Commission. But it was the Peel Commission in 1937 that first suggested that the way to resolve this tension was to set up two separate countries in the area, two separate nations, one for the Jewish community and one for the Arabic community. Now, the subsequent report by the British government, the Woodhead Report, dismissed this proposal, but the Jewish community again saw the Peel Commission as another example of the British government supporting their immigration to the area and supporting their claims for a new state. So through the Second World War, the British did their best to minimise the violence and the tensions in the area. They set quite firm limits on the amount of Jewish immigration that would be allowed. And in light of the events in Europe at the time, the horrific persecution of the Jewish community, the Holocaust, that this caused a huge amount of antagonism in the Jewish community towards the British government. Upon the end of the Second World War in 1945, and the revelation of the horrors of the death camps, the horrors of the Holocaust, the international community were far more sympathetic to the plight of the Jewish communities and their desires to have their own homeland. Tens of thousands of Jews who had survived the concentration camps or who had managed to survive in Europe understandably wanted to flee. They no longer wanted to live in Europe, and they began to come in the tens of thousands to Palestine. Now, at the time, this was illegal. The British government still had tight caps on immigration. In fact, there's one incident where the British arrested or captured some of the boats of these Jews coming in and put the Jewish immigrants into prison camps on Cyprus. So some of the people on these boats had survived the concentration camps of the Holocaust, decided to come to Palestine, but then have been put into more prison camps by the British on Cyprus. So there's some really tragic stories. Many groups in Palestine, the Jewish extremists like the Irgun, began to take more violent action towards the British, and the Irgun actually bombed the King David Hotel, which was the centre of the British administration at the time. So the British were clearly losing control of the situation. Now, the British had lost huge amounts of money during the war, and there was a feeling back in London that they needed to pull back from many of their colonial commitments. So they made it clear that they were going to withdraw from the area by 1948, and the UN came in, the newly formed United Nations came in to see if it could work out a solution to the problem before the British left. And so they designed a plan to partition Palestine, to go with the two states solution that was initially suggested by the Peel Commission. And so the Jewish communities would be given some of the land, and the Palestinians would be given other parts of the land. Jerusalem itself would and Bethlehem would still be controlled by the United Nations. Now, lots of Jewish communities actually were quite unhappy with this because they wanted the whole of Palestine for themselves. But the Jewish leaders, one of the main Jewish leaders coming out was Ben-Gurion. I said actually this was a good start, and they could build from this start to expanding their nation in the future. None of the surrounding Arab nations, none of the Arab communities in Palestine supported this deal at all, particularly because the new Jewish state would be given a lot of the most fertile land on the coast. And so there was actually no agreement from any of the Arab communities. But the British went on with their plans, and they began to withdraw from the area, and until the 14th of May, 1948, when it was decided that the Israeli state would come into being. And so, the very next day, on the 15th of May 1948, the armies of Jordan and Syria and Egypt and Iraq, soon to be followed by military units from the Lebanon, launched a huge attack on the new Israeli state. They said to restore law and order to the area, and they had overwhelmingly superior numbers. However, there was very little tactical and strategical agreement between the invading Arab countries. In fact, they were all seeking their own individual political ends. So it wasn't a unified war effort. And to their surprise, the new Israeli state was incredibly well armed. The Czechoslovakian government, who had made quite a few weapons for the Syrian government, actually at the last minute changed the destination of those weapons. They went to the new Kingdom of Israel, and so the Haganah and other Israeli military groups had state-of-the-art weaponry with which they managed to defeat the largely disorganized Arabic forces. So in 1949, an armistice was signed, and it was a ceasefire agreement where the new country of Israel, its borders expanded greatly. The area on the east bank of the River Jordan, of the west bank of the River Jordan, known as the West Bank, would be controlled by Jordan, and a thin strip of land near Gaza, to the south of Palestine, known as the Gaza Strip, would be controlled by Egypt and Jordan. Jerusalem, the East Jerusalem would be controlled by Jordan, and West Jerusalem would be controlled by Israel. And so this was the territorial outcome by the end of the First Arab-Israeli War, with Israeli territorial gains, Israel making huge territorial gains. But one of the main other consequences of this conflict was the number of refugees. So tens and thousands of Palestinians, Palestinian Arabs fled areas such as Jaffa after violence towards them, and due to the fighting. And when the new country of Israel was created, again, lots of Palestinians fled those areas which were to be ruled by the Jews. Now, Ben Gurion, the leader of the new state of Israel, he said he basically refused to accept any of these refugees back after when the armistice was signed. Even though some tried to sneak their way across the border, they were very quickly captured and sent back to either the West Bank or the Gaza Strip. So by the end of 1949, you have a situation where you have a huge displaced population of Palestinians who live in the area around Gaza and who live in the West Bank, waiting for an opportunity to go back to their homes in land that is now the new state of Israel. And even today, those communities are still there in the Gaza Strip, are still there in the West Bank, waiting to reclaim what they see as their rightful homes.